T-A and all the way down to your block. Lower than your mama's ever seen it in a lifetime. Never would have imagined it, not even in her right mind. Practice in front of that mirror, now you doing it on the dance floor. Mad cause I can't get with you, shit, just show me how to dance. I may not wanna get low, so I'm posted up, kinda like a player dude. But if you come to the crib, then I might show you girls a thing or two. Yeah, I think you a superstar. With an ass like that, you gotta blow. Before you make it big, there's just one thing that I gotta know.
How's it going, guys, and welcome back to another build video. This one is on what I have decided to call Cold Snap Amara, as you've seen, it is very cryo damage heavy, but is also a gun damage focused build for Amara. Of course, with all that cryo and all those splash guns that we use, we make very heavy use of Unweave the Rainbow, which we will get into a little bit deeper shortly, but for now I will mention that it is pretty much Amara's version of Fire in the Stag Den. Before we get into that though, there's a few more things that I would like to go over first, so let's get into it. So first of all, let's start with our gear and our weapons. On all of our weapons, we are using Phase Slam 300% weapon damage, as we want to try to maximize our weapon damage as much as we possibly can because of how that interacts with Unweave the Rainbow. Again, I'll explain why a little bit later, but for now, this is the anointment we use on literally everything. All of our gear is also cryo damage, as since we are using Clear the Mind, we don't really need to worry about swapping our elements and element matching. However, I do carry around different elements just in case, as Clear the Mind does not work against elemental immunities, meaning that for some enemy types you will need to swap. Of course, there's also just some gear that works really well with this build, like the Free Radical or the Roizen's Thorns. That is completely element lock, but as long as you swap your element, you can use them just fine. Now, generally, as long as it deals elemental damage and splash damage, the gun is going to work amazing on this build. There are a few standouts that I would like to point out, however. The Unkempt Herald is just a very strong splash damage pistol. The Prompt Critical is very similar, however, I do tend to prefer the Unkempt Herald. The Kib's Worth is very nice, as this build does lack a lot of survivability, so those health regen circles can actually help quite a bit, along with the front-facing shield whenever you ADS. And the Anarchy is probably the single best shotgun for this build. Things like the Trevinator and such are also very good, but the Anarchy stacking is actually weapon damage, meaning that when you're fully stacked, you are getting even more weapon damage out of this to boost with Unweave the Rainbow. Now for your launchers, you can use pretty much any of the usual meta ones, the Plague Bearer, the Kick Charger, both of those are also very good options, but I've actually noticed that I really prefer the Backburner for this build. I don't know what it is specifically about it, maybe it's just because it stacks our Pearl of Ineffable Knowledge very well, but the Backburner definitely feels like the best of the options. Now speaking of the Pearl, that is the relic that we use. I forgot to explain this, but the reason we do use it is because that 90% bonus when it is fully stacked is weapon damage, but the stacking damage itself actually isn't, but that 90% weapon damage is probably the biggest weapon damage boost that you can get from an artifact. Okay, bye. You can also use a Company Man, as the Company Man can give you a 50% weapon damage boost with a specific type, so if you find yourself using a lot of manufacturer-specific guns, the Company Man can be very good, as long as you get that damage roll on it. For some bosses, the Toboggan is also better. This doesn't really give you actual weapon damage though, so for a lot of the time, if you're able to stack the Pearl on a boss before killing it, the Pearl is better. However, the Toboggan is better against things where you can't do that. Now, why we don't use, say, an Icebreaker auto-idle to survive a little bit better, or a Victory Rush for just more damage, that is because the Victory Rush is V1 damage, and the Icebreaker is V2 damage. This is also the same reason we do not use On Grenade Throw. The On Grenade Throw anointment is also V2 damage. These do not actually give you weapon damage, which means that it's not really interacting well with Unweave the Rainbow. So instead we opt for gun damage in the case of our relics, and for our grenades we use an ASE. I prefer radiation, as the explosions can be very nice, but really you can use whatever you want. As for our shield, we use a Frozen Heart or a Frozen Snowshoe. As long as either of those have Ash Break, it will work just as well as each other, as they are pretty much the same. This is really good, as the Nova heals you, so it ups our survivability a little bit, along with instantly freezing literally everything around you, so you can proc Unweave the Rainbow on all of it. Very important and quite core to this build. And then our Kensei, which is definitely an interesting choice for a few reasons, and I will explain how this class mod works, because it isn't as straightforward as it seems. After activating her action still, Amara deals 10% bonus melee damage of her attuned element type with her weapons for the next 6 seconds. So we'll break this down. 10% bonus melee damage. This is not actually melee damage. This is 10% bonus damage based off of your melee damage boost. So the higher your melee damage boost, the more damage you get from this. But again, it is not actually melee damage. Specifically, what it is damage of her attuned element, which means that if you're using shock for your attuned element and shooting something with a cryo gun, you will not get any sort of damage boost at all. This isn't a bonus damage like an ASE or like infusion. This is a boost to your attuned element damage. So if you have your attuned element as shock and you fire a shotgun, then you get this damage boost. We don't focus on this actual passive of the Kensei too much. It is nice to have, it is nice to play around, it is why we use mostly cryo and keep cryo as our attuned element unless we have to swap off. But generally, we aren't specifically sacrificing skills so that we can get more melee damage. In fact, there's a few easy melee damage boosts that we miss, instead going for gun damage because that is significantly more important. The main reason we use the Kensei is because the Kensei can roll with Unweave the Rainbow. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to get a +3 into Unweave the Rainbow yet, so I'm only at 5 out of 3, but if you do get that +3, that is the most important roll. If you are going for better passives, you can roll weapon damage on this. You can also roll melee damage. Those are definitely the two passives that you want. I do have one here that has those two passives, but unfortunately, it didn't roll with any Unweave the Rainbow whatsoever. So this one, even though it has way better passives, is significantly worse than the one that I currently have. The one I do currently have is SMG damage, which is unfortunately not actually weapon damage, but it does have Molly 1 weapon damage, which while only 14% is still a very small weapon damage boost. So generally what you want on your Kensei is weapon damage, melee damage, and a manufacturer weapon damage boost. So moving on to our skill trees, let's talk about Unweave the Rainbow and why this is so goddamn good. As I said earlier, Unweave the Rainbow is pretty much Amara's version of Fire in the Stag Den, and that's because it almost identically is. While for Unweave the Rainbow, you deal bonus damage of your attuned element whenever you deal melee or splash damage to frozen enemies, so it is a little more contingent on freezing an enemy, rather than Fire in the Stag Den, which is just do splash damage. Unweave the Rainbow, similarly to Stag Den, gets Mayhem scaling, which is why this can make pretty much any splash gun hit for hundreds of millions to billions of damage. However, it is also worth noting that Unweave the Rainbow only scales off of your weapon damage portion of your damage formula. This does not take into account splash damage boosts, elemental damage boosts, crit damage boosts, anything like that. It is only the base gun damage part. However, you can scale that gun damage, and it does take those into account, which is why we use things like 300% gun damage after Phase Slam, and the Pearl of Ineffable Knowledge, and all these other boosts to our gun damage within our skill trees. Because however high we boost that gun damage, Unweave the Rainbow will take 33 to 66% of that damage, and then multiply it by 31 times because it gets Mayhem scaling for some ungodly reason, letting us hit for an insane amount of damage. The rest of this tree is pretty standard though. We take No Mistakes in Nature, just a little bit of melee damage while also helping us move further down the tree. Heavy Rain, because we want that splash damage. We are dealing a lot of splash damage, so while this doesn't interact with Unweave the Rainbow, it is still very nice to have. This does interact with Unweave the Rainbow, Go with the Flow, we take for the gun damage, but the movement speed is also very nice. We put 4 points into Joyful Freedom, as this gives us some more melee damage and helps us get down the tree further, and Burn Both Ends, as this gives us more damage, and I did try to test this as best I could. I do believe that this is actually gun damage, but at the very least it does seem to interact well with Unweave the Rainbow. We then put 1 point into Free the Soul, as we do a lot of freezing, and this can help us freeze even more enemies. And of course Clear the Mind, since we are using mostly cryo damage. It is nice to not have to worry about element matching. However, again, this doesn't work with elemental immunity, so that is why we carry around a bunch of different elements of our guns. Under our second largest tree, this is pretty standard. 5 into Do Harm, 1 into Violent Tapestry. This one is really just to move down. 3 out of 3 in Transcend, just because we get a little bit of extra critical hit damage, but mostly this is also to move down. Restless for cooldown rate, because we want to be able to spam our action still as much as possible. This is also why we make our way all the way down to Avatar, because we can get 2 casts of our skill before having to let it recharge. Ascendant, just because it's a decent skill. Laid Bare for a very nice damage increase for anything hit by our action skill. Unfortunately, this is not gun damage, but it is still damage. Wrath, because this is one of Amara's biggest gun damage boosts, boost in her actual skill tree. Of course, we want this. Awakening just increases rush stack effectiveness. Again, this is mostly just to get down to Avatar. And 1 point into Remnant as always, because Remnant is broken. Especially with how much damage you're dealing with Unweave the Rainbow, Remnant can hit for a shit ton of damage. And then finally, our green tree, we start with Personal Space, a very nice damage boost because we are going to be in enemies' faces quite often. 2 points into Clarity to help us get down, but also to give us a little bit of that survivability, which we are very heavily lacking. Samsara is also very nice for this, but this also gives us gun damage, which can stack up to another 20% if you hit 5 enemies with your action skill. More splash damage because we are doing a lot of splash damage. And then these 4 points here don't really need to be here. I just didn't really know where else to put them. There's not really anywhere better to put just 4 random points. So I just took Find Your Center for a little bit of melee damage and Mindfulness for a little bit of movement speed. As for our stills, you can use really any of the slam stills. I just prefer Fracture as it just is a little bit smoother, and also I think it's really cool. However, if you would prefer to use something a little bit better than slam, you can also very reasonably use Phase Cast, as Phase Cast is a significantly better action skill. And it also has the, after using Phase Cast, get 250% weapon damage Anointment, which you would want to switch all of your gear to, which you are losing 50% weapon damage, but that's not really that big of a deal when we already have so much. I just honestly prefer using Fracture because I like the skill more, but that is definitely personal preference. For our Augment, I like using Revelation as it just spreads more of our damage out and can apply Cryo to more things, and it also helps us spread out Laid Bare quite nicely. And then as for our Element, most of you use Cryo damage. However, if you're fighting something with an elemental immunity, then you can swap to whatever else you may need. That's gonna about do it for this one though. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, as always, please consider leaving a like, comment, subscribe, all of that. You can also go down into the description to join my Discord and find all of the save files for all of my builds, including this one. Down there will also be a link to my Twitch channel where I will be live after this video goes up. If you want to just come hang out or have any questions about this build or anything else, feel free to stop on by. But with that all being said, I hope to see you guys in the next one.